welcome to Canada's History's Fall Webinar Series. This series revolves around women's history. If you've come out before, you know this. Presenters will speak about prominent figures, moments, and places in Canada's women's history, as well as what has influenced the teaching of women's history in the classroom and what it looks like today. My name is Jessica Knapp, and I will be the host for this series. Tonight, Rose Fine-Meyer will discuss her research that answers how does community influence the teaching of women's history in the classroom. This is the fourth of 7 webinars in this series. So we're just past halfway. Canada's History is proud to bring you this webinar series, as well as our many award opportunities and publications. Canada's History is dedicated to promoting greater popular interest in Canadian history, principally through publishing, education, and recognition programs. Our flagship publications are Canada's History Magazine and Canada's History for Kids. Each year, Canada's History recognizes excellence and honors the achievements of history makers and enthusiasts of all ages, predominantly through the Governor-General's History Awards and the Government of Canada History Awards. If you would like to know more about these opportunities, please follow the web addresses, or the links rather, on the screen. As well, if you would like to know about more about Canada's History Magazine or Kayak, you can also click on the screen now to discover more and potentially subscribe. In all cases, you are welcome to email me for more information as well. You should know Canada's History's vision is a Canada where people are deeply engaged in connecting with their shared past. To ensure the best experience possible tonight, I encourage you to close down any unnecessary larger programs that your computer may be running, so InDesign, Photoshop, things like that. However, if there are issues tonight, don't fret, as we are recording, and they've been turning out very nicely thus far, and I have no reason to suspect it will be any different for tonight. If you are on social media, you are welcome to spread the word and information from our conversation tonight. I have included Canada's History's Twitter handle and Facebook link on that screen that you can click on for easy access. And if you have questions during tonight's webinar, as most of you are already familiar, you are welcome to ask them at any time in the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner. That is available for you to communicate with both myself and Rose. So a little bit about Rose. Dr. Rose Fine-Meyer teaches in the Masters of Teaching program at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on history education in Canada. She explores the relationships between provincially sanctioned curricula, teachers' pedagogical practices, and place-based learning experiences, both in the past and in the present. She recently was honored by the OHS for her work as part of the OHFA as a guest editor of the special edition of Ontario History, which is a journal they publish. On a community level, she has developed and programmed local women's history talk series, namely herstoriescafe.com, and in the emails you've received, you will have seen a link to that, so I recommend go check it out. This project was recognized in 2012 with the Heritage Toronto Community Award. Rose is also a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012 and the Governor-General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2007. At this time, I would like to introduce you to Rose Fine-Meyer, and she will take away the evening. You want to unmute your microphone, Rose. Hello, Rose, are you with us?
Can everyone hear now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. And I just want to check that everything's moving when I click on it. Yes, it is. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you, Jessica, for that nice introduction. I realize that we're competing on this special day with the new government. So I appreciate the people who have taken the time to come out. I had to tear myself away from the news. I'm very honored to speak this evening as part of Canada's History webinar series, and I want to thank them for inviting me to share my work and to acknowledge, in fact, their exceptional work to promote Canadian history and certainly to promote best practice in Canadian history education. So great, let's start. I thought it was interesting that you played Celine Dion's This is a New Day and a New Dawn, so how appropriate for today with the new government. My talk tonight is going to focus on my work, as Jessica noted, in history and social studies education. And I'll just give a little bit of an introduction and then we'll just start. And I'm going to give examples throughout, but I'll give a general context at first. So as a scholar of curriculum teaching and learning and a curriculum developer and practitioner, my scholarship is deeply informed by my practice, in particular the work that I've done to ground history education in community-based knowledges and understanding. My investigations tend to be rooted in oral histories. I like to explore the ways in which community members, reformers, activists, and educators have an impact on what takes place in classrooms, in schools, and of course, many of them are women. The stories of women's lived experiences in Canada, I'm going to be arguing in this talk, can be found in the communities in which they were actively engaged or in which they lived. And women have historically taken a leadership role in a wide range of organizations, developing multiple and diverse networks that help support families and communities. And it's that community connection which I'm focusing on today. So we'll just get moving here. So women has, as I noticed, have actively lobbied governments and institutions to press for reforms. And this was certainly true for women's activism in obtaining the vote, or in pressing for the right to hold seats in the Senate, or in demanding equal rights, access to education, ownership of property, opening women's shelters or schools or community centers to support a wide range of community needs. Women's networking and activism, in fact, has been key to making societal change. We have here Dr. Emily Stowe, who was part of the Toronto Women's Literary Club in the 1870s, and that became the Toronto Women's Suffrage Association in the 1880s, focused on obtaining the franchise, but also focused on improved educational opportunities for women. As Ruth Sandwell, Mark Ketchney, and Linda Ambrose have noted, Women's Institutes and the National Council of Women spearheaded a range of educational initiatives, including publicly funded home economics and domestic science programs across the country that were specifically targeted at transforming the way that women worked in the home and helped support women's leadership roles within their communities. So in my work to explore women's history and curricula, I found that the inclusion of women in schools can be directly linked to the work of women scholars. Women's history resources used in classrooms beginning in the 1970s were the direct product of networking between women's history scholars, women's organizations, feminist publishers, and educators. And you can see some of the stories here on the screen. They're very diverse. Women were clearly holding jobs across the country, all kinds of jobs. We have an example here of women working at looms in Ontario, building boats in Nova Scotia, and lumber yards in Edmonton. And a lot of these stories became prominent because of the work of women's history scholars. Feminist and social history scholarship then, throughout the 1970s and 80s, key scholars that you would probably know, like Alison Prentice and Veronica Strongbow, or Joan Sangster and Ruby Heat and Jean Barman, to name only a few, gave voice to women's lived experience and exposed their absence from history course studies. And teachers who were interested in including women in their history courses then had to network outside their schools. They were seeking out these supplementary resources, and they did that through a variety of ways. Many joined women's organizations. One example was the Federation of Women's Teachers Association, FW, or the Ontario Women's History Network, OWN. And these were places where educators could co-ed conferences where the scholars were speaking and where research on Canadian women's history could be found. OWN, for instance, continues an organization today, and they still have annual conferences. We're going to be having one in Toronto in the spring. There's also the Canadian Committee of Women's History. So here we have women again working everywhere, and those resources then became available across the country. Nootka women weaving baskets in the Northwest, working in boot factories in Vancouver, cotton factories in Windsor, Nova Scotia, and the Huntington copper mines. So these stories about women's extraordinary work and important work across the country. My doctoral research looked at how social movement and widespread activism during the 60s and 70s spilled into a range of educational circles and influenced history teachers. Women's organizations developed broad networks, created and published resources. But what Wendy Robbins notes, while the women's liberation movement was international, and it certainly was national in Canada, its organizational forms were typically small and local. So you had these, like you see on the screen there, you had materials that were published about peace and freedom and civil rights on International Women's Day, or marches that were taking place. But these were happening not just on a national level, as I said, they were happening within everybody's community. So those stories are there, and they're very rich. I drew on a wide range of sources for my PhD, including private collections and lots of oral histories, to uncover what became multi-layered relationships that existed between parents and governments and teachers. The fundamental work to include women then in history curricula relied heavily on these grassroots networks in communities that allowed women's experience to leak into classrooms. And at the forefront were women's committees and women's teachers and librarians and affirmative action representatives. And what I have here on the screen that I looked at, and there's literally hundreds of these publications that are community-based, is at the Work Collection, the Women's Education Resource Collection. Exceptional, and if you're interested, there's wonderful things there. That's on the second floor at OHFA, University of Toronto. And in fact, the story of how all of that became there is an interesting story about women networking and making sure that these things remain. So we can talk about that later if you're interested. And of course, within the broader public sphere, contributions by parents and activists, publishers and reformers, there was across this country in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, and then again in the 90s with the anti-nuclear war activism, substantial grassroots activism that demonstrates the ways in which, again, community bottom-up initiatives, which I have argued in a lot of my publications, are a powerful force for making curricular change. So say take this publication that came out of Vancouver, The Pedestal. It was a women's liberation newspaper where they talked about a lot of wide range of things. But what I did was I found this paper everywhere, all over Ontario. So these things, even though they were local, they became national, and there was this wonderful sharing of ideas at that time. I guess we're doing that more online now. And also this wonderful publication, if you can get your hands on this is just a wonderful, so written in 1971, and I've been trying to get this republished. I've taken it to several people because it's so extraordinary. So there's a long story which I can tell you about it at the end if you're interested in how this publication came. But this was all part of Vietnam anti-war activism, basically Americans who were coming up who didn't know anything about Canada. And the women that were there, that were part of the women's movement in Vancouver, they said, well, let's create a publication, but let's do it from a women's perspective. So they created this book called She Named It Canada. And it's just a wonderful history of Canada for those Americans, and then it became Canadians, but through the lens of women. And the idea of having women's perspective, thought of the book that Pat Staten has published from Green Dragon Press. She's published a lot of materials. I would encourage you to go to greendragonpress.com. The other book that's really good for classrooms, if you're a classroom teacher, you want to look at documents, is Unfolding Power. And here the book, Working Light, is using photographer Edith Watson, who traveled across Canada in the 1890s, and she was documenting the lives of rural women. A lot of women are in that, rural people, I mean, and a real focus on what women were doing. As I say here on the slide, she photographed working women in fish lakes in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, making soap and weaving and spinning in Quebec and across the prairies and into British Columbia. And she spent 3 summers among the Doukhobors in Alberta and BC. So these books are a sort of rich reflection of the collections that are available if you're looking for a woman's perspective. So going to a sort of high of publications that appeared in the 1980s as a result of activism in the 60s and 70s, and then into the early 90s, you know, certainly one, and we can discuss this later, is, well, what happened? Why are there not enough or equal materials in history classes today? And I'd love to have that conversation later on, but what I'm arguing is that in this is that new publications weren't the only way to find women's narratives or lived experiences. Another was what's been present all along, which is women's experiences in communities. So unfortunately, as I say, there still remains in place a lack of women's lived experiences in history courses, and that's just not just in school, that's everywhere. And so I'm thinking that teachers need to apply different pedagogical approaches to reach out to local communities where women's voices are very strong. And I think that also will allow us to focus on the diversity of women's experience, which I think is crucial. So I'm arguing that teachers can do this in 2 ways. First, by taking a non-traditional perspective, one that's not explored in teaching resources. So for instance, exploring those missing women's narratives. Like everybody talks in schools about women's suffrage, but the women's suffrage was not extended to First Nations women until the 1960s. That needs to come out in any kind of discussion about suffrage. It often isn't. So, but it's a way to explore another narrative, which I think opens up a different dialogue. And also, second, teachers can bring in these local narratives that I'm suggesting are full of and rich stories about women's leaderships in their communities. And so here's an example. Pat Staten wrote a book, and of course I'm doing a lot of Toronto-centric things because this is where I live and this is where I teach. So she wrote a book called Toronto Women, A Walk Through History. And we had her speak at the Heliconian Club, very appropriate because it was founded by women to bring and recognize women's experiences and to meet, as it says in the slide, socially and intellectually. It was an arts and letters club. And so in here you can walk around different parts of Toronto. It's a walking tour book. She doesn't include all areas of Toronto, but what I'm thinking here is that I know that in everybody's community, there are these books, and you might even know about people who are doing the tours where they walk around different communities all across this country, bringing in these local stories, personal, public stories. It also focuses on local environments, stories about rivers, local architecture, looking at homes and buildings. So Pat talks about women who've passed through Toronto's. First, she looks at people who would have spoken in public places like Massey Hall. And there's just such a brilliant range of people like Nellie McClung, right, who, as you know, was a social political reformer and suffrage and the famous Five and on and on. Adelaide Hoodless, who founded, of course, the Women's Institutes. And then people who were traveling through Toronto, like Susan B. Anthony. She was, as you know, a U.S. campaigner for suffrage and a civil rights activist. Or Sylvia Pankhurst, who was a UK campaigner, who also for suffrage. Or someone like Emma Goldman, who lived in Toronto for a little bit of time. She was a political activist and a social reformer. So there are all these women that are passing through Toronto. So their stories are very rich. But there's also those women who didn't pass through, but actually lived here. And the book allows you to sort of walk past their house or where their house used to be, such as Augusta Stowe Collin, who was a medical doctor and a suffrage campaigner. She was Emily Stowe's daughter. And you know, Emily Stowe was the first Canadian woman to practice medicine. And she also founded Women's College Hospital. And oh, speaking of which, Women's College Hospital has this fabulous 100-year history document that's online for anybody who's interested. And who else? Minerva Reed, who was the first female, I think she was the first female chief surgeon in all of North America. Also a founder of Women's College Hospital. So exceptional women, and they're in this little book, but what I'm arguing is these little books are across the country in every community, and certainly in rural communities and smaller cities where they, as I say, have this rich history of women's leadership and activism. And those are great to bring into a classroom because I think it enhances any historical study. And it also brings in diverse voices. So moving along, here we are at the Her Stories Cafe. As Jessica noted, I started Her Stories Cafe with my colleague and friend Kate Zankowitz in 2010 to bring this rich history of women's experience into a more public forum. People didn't have an opportunity to hear these stories, and we thought that we would fill that gap. So much of our past is circumscribed by a masculine framework that often distorts and in some cases plainly omits women and their accomplishments. So what sorts of things do we usually learn in history courses, textbooks, or one could say in public memorials or museums? Well, we learn about gender division and gender ideals that have been culturally determined. We learn that what counts as history is not within the province of women's experiences or contributions. And often when women are represented, we know that the women themselves probably would not have chose to be represented in that way. But often it's not the women who make the choices about what counts as history in a textbook, how they're portrayed in museums, or online, or even in Parliament Hill. So these predetermined roles of what women should be known for, what they can and cannot accomplish, are kind of difficult to escape. In fact, they're even become, I would argue, very normalized in classrooms and heritage sites. So what we wanted to do with Her Stories Cafe is to explore women's narratives through their own voices, something absolutely essential to understanding our past, certainly in a more equitable way. And there's so few forums in which to do this, and Her Stories Cafe has provided this sort of space over the years for an honest examination of women, often featuring these feminist scholars that I spoke about earlier who are writing about these women. And so Kate Zankowitz moved away to Los Angeles, and that sort of put a stop to the Her Stories for a little while, but I have gotten that going again, and I'm organizing a couple events where I'm partnering with the Archives of Ontario. And so if you follow me on Twitter at Her Stories Cafe, I'll definitely update you about that. And what I wanted to point out here, the reason I picked these pictures for the Her Stories Cafe is that you see the logo up here at the top. So we got that logo. This is a Frida Mass from the 1920s. She was a race car driver. I think actually she died racing in the 1930s, but I'm not exactly sure about that. But we found her when we were at the CNE Archives. So there's a great place, another place to go. Go to local archives in your community. In Toronto, there's a CNE Archives where we found such a rich history. So one of the Her Stories talks then took place at the CNE Archives. We had Emily Beliveau, who was or is creator at the Huron County Museum. And she presented work that she had been doing. She had been doing research work at the CNE. In fact, you can go there between whatever the particular hours are and do the work. And it's just such a fabulous place. Textual holdings, photographs, posters, They have ephemera, catalogs, ticket stubs, prizes, programs, photos, souvenirs, so many fun things about Exhibition Place and, of course, the Canadian National Exhibition. So lots of stuff about women, because women were very active at the CNE. There always was women's programming. In fact, it was quite central to the exhibition. At one point, there was a women's building. Of course, it was men that were all running the women's movement, but it was there, and always women had an important. Women would come to the CNE and see, particularly, what kind of programming reflected their own interests and experiences. The official programming of women was discontinued during the 1980s when their initiatives were absorbed by other departments, but it's a wonderful collection that provides a sort of window into the past about women's experiences at fairs, and it's over different periods of time. So that's a wonderful place to go to find materials for a classroom. So moving along, Elizabeth Simcoe. So Elizabeth Simcoe's diaries and her sketches, which are, by the way, held at the Archives of Ontario. And when we did do a talk at the Archives of Ontario initially, this is actually my picture. They just laid the diaries and the sketches out on a table. I have a whole bunch of pictures of it. So that was just so special to be part of it, because there's from the 1700s. And it's so exciting to be able to connect with any kind of document from that long ago. All right, but on the bottom left corner, okay, so my picture's on the right, and the bottom left corner is a sort of typical picture of what Elizabeth Simcoe would look like, right? So what I call the unnamed colonial woman is usually portrayed in museums, historic houses, and texts as women of leisure. Of course, they always have nice hats. See Elizabeth's nice big blue hat. And they're named in portraits of a certain class. So Lady Simcoe and sort of Lady Jarvis, that's Hannah Jarvis, they would have been painted. The others, you have to go searching for them, because they're in a particular class group where they had somebody would paint them. It's always portrayed as this ideal mother. They had husbands who were militia officers, in this case, Queen's Rangers in the 1770s. Sort of privileged women being enculturated through music. You see them writing, painting. If we're in Quebec, then they're nuns as educators in a French-Canadian context. So colonial women's material culture supports that history. If you go into any museum, you know, you'll see their desks, their violins, their writing boxes. So I can think of no better way to demonstrate just how essential women were in colonial Canada than to look at Elizabeth Simcoe herself, who was born in England. She was orphaned at birth, so born in 1762. She was raised by her grandmother and subsequently married John Graves Simcoe, who, as you know, became the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. But in marrying him, she was actually marrying him as a kind of step down for her, at least in a sort of status sense. Nevertheless, so many women in historical accounts are granted historical legitimacy through her husbands, and in a study that was done in 1989 to see, so that's quite late already, since I was talking about women's movement initiatives in the 60s and 70s. So in 1989, there was a study that was done by a group of scholars at OHFA to look at history textbooks and documents to see how many times women were even mentioned. And always there would be Simcoe and his wife. So they would, that's how, you know, so John Graves Simcoe and his wife, they don't even name her, they say, and her wife, and that counted out of the one of 17 places where they actually included women in 1989. So going back, here's this, you know, story is that in 1791, as you know, she accompanied her husband to Upper Canada to the Toronto area, where she traveled extensively. But here's the thing. She was an avid artist, and when you see her diaries and her sketches, you're just blown away. She was a cartographer. She was a botanist. Her drawings and letters and records of this new colony in the late 18th century continue to be a valuable historical resource. Governor Simcoe named the townships of West, East, and North Gwillimbury after her. You can see her name. Still calling her my most excellent and noble wife. Impressions of life back then describe a sort of unique account of specific place and time, but they're very valuable to us as historians. I always say she's the one who first sketched the Toronto, what's the word I want to say? Too long a day. My son moved today. She sketched the waterfront. There's the word. And at that time, of course, we didn't have the islands. They hadn't been broken there. And so the sort of quote unquote protected waterfront that we always heard about is evident in her sketches. And nowhere else, by the way, can we learn that after a hard day of traveling through unbroken terrain, Elizabeth and her entourage dined in the woods and ate a raccoon, which she describes as being akin in taste to lamb if you consumed it with mint sauce. So she becomes Canada's unofficial surveyor. I would say she's probably one of the first people who described Yonge and Dundas intersection, and whose watercolors, of course, as I've mentioned, are an invaluable source of historical information. Her maps are not just maps. They're stories about what Canada was like back then. Her diaries are important sources of historical information. So here we have women as sources of history, not just as memory. Or if we look at the voices of Aboriginal women, we know that women were artisans, they were makers. But if you go into traditional museum collections, you know, they sort of reflect a patriarchal bias. Here we have Haida culture, for example. It's matrilineal. Reading the weave of the crown of hats is like reading a woman's fingerprint. And I'm quoting Kara Kopocek, who spoke at the ROM, at her stories, to talk about her work, to understand Haida women through the weaving that they did. So Kara was involved with the project with the Pitt Rivers Museum, where material culture was being brought back to quote-unquote source communities. So Haida women were brought over. They were able to insert their knowledge into the collection's management record. They could recognize which women from which clan was made the hats based on material cues. The absent women who made the objects were made present then and re-articulated into the museum spaces in the UK. And although the First Peoples Gallery at the ROM does a fairly good job of acknowledging the contribution of women to First Peoples societies, galleries in general contain notable silences, particularly as it relates to the women who made the objects on display. In the ROM, for instance, in the early Canadiana gallery, there's a beautiful desk from Quebec, and they talk about the desk and where it was from, but they don't talk about the makers, and the makers are in fact women who had the skills of gold inlay. So there were experts in gold inlay, and of course that's never recognized. Makers are never recognized in that way. And so Indigenous women, also the work of Naomi Smith, who's a First Nations educator and artisan, explores the history and tradition of beadcraft, and she spoke at one of her stories. So there's so much to learn about the importance of beading. I wanted to learn that, so I was fortunate. I signed up to spend a day at the Woodland Cultural Center. I would highly recommend that. I spent it with Naomi, with Cheryl Red Eagle, and the elders who were working there to complete the task of beading a cuff. So that was a challenge. I did it for 8 hours with these tiny needles and beads. The best part about it, of course, was the support I got from everybody in the circle. I was listening and learning from the elders in the circle who shared their stories and also got me out of trouble all the time, every time I made a mistake, which is quite often because it's quite a skill, and you need many years to develop that skill. So for educators, turning to an Indigenous elder in their community can bring these traditional stories into their classrooms, and I highly recommend it. Because stories are tied to particular places. They're tied to the land, to the water, to plants and animals. Traditional knowledges help us better understand the challenges that we've all faced, and certainly that were faced by Indigenous women, navigating through multiple communities over time, their own and those of colonial settlers. And I wanted to bring this experience of being and being part of Indigenous knowledge and storytelling into my own classroom at the university. So I'd recommend that you look into that. And of course, there's so much now that's available to talk about the experiences of girls, the effects and the impact of colonial practices on Indigenous girls, and the racism that they faced in the schools that they were forced to attend, that they were taken from their parents and families and communities, that they were removed from their social network, their language and culture, and forced to learn Western knowledge and practices. So again, here's where oral testimonies are important. A lot of people wonder, how can we bring these stories into the classroom? Well, bring in these oral testimonies. They're a way that students can access these stories and this history. So for instance, in my class, we go online to the Truth and Conciliation Commission report and read it, and the oral histories that were the testimonies that they used for that report. So all of the links, by the way, that I've been putting on these slides are places that I'm talking about, so you don't have to go and look them up. A lot of them are right there for you to click on. I'd also recommend OHFA has set up a Deepening Knowledges website where you can access lots of different things that I've been talking about and other things. I saw just yesterday that the terabytes of testimony, this is what it's called, digital database of residential school stories, is now open to the public. So those oral testimonies, those oral stories, those community challenges that women and girls faced are now available for you to include in your classroom or in your research work. And again, oral histories and diaries, as I've been speaking about, help us also understand the lived experiences of Black Canadian women and the ways in which they have navigated multiple forms of oppression. Their remarkable voices are there. They're in all communities, and they demonstrate the strength of character they develop to deal with their restrictions and in order to build strong relationships and leadership positions within their own communities. So we have here on the slide the work of Adrienne Shad, and there's a link down at the bottom, but Adrienne Shad came and spoke at a Her Stories Cafe. And what she was talking about was different perspectives. So in this collection called The Refugee, that comes from the mid-1800s, is quotes from various narratives, as they say, of fugitive slaves in Canada. It's an important historical document. And in there, Sophie Poley states an interesting quote. She says, well, there were hardly any white people in Canada then. Nothing here but Indians and wild beasts. I was a woman grown when the first governor of Canada came from England, and that was Governor Simcoe. So I love that because we've got Lady Simcoe and Governor Simcoe, Elizabeth Simcoe's materials to talk about that time. And she is saying something else here. And to get another perspective is very important. So first-person account of slavery is an important document to include. So these are unique stories of women who faced particular challenges. The other was the story of M. Marie Jackson, and 7 of her, I think it was 11 children, who migrated through the Underground Railroad into Toronto, where she then created a new life. That's the work of historian Afua Cooper, who also came and spoke at a Her Stories Cafe. This is a remarkable story because it's, as Afua has noted, it's more rare to hear about a woman's escape because, in fact, it was much harder for them. Of course, none of her children would have been with her, so her children would have been in other places all over. For her to gather those children, find them, and then with this large group, make their way up to Toronto is just a remarkable story. And then the new life that she creates and a community leader that she becomes. And then, of course, more current is Rosemary Brown, the first Black woman in Canadian history to be a member of Canadian Parliament, who dedicated significant community work. There's a lot about her work in her communities. So teachers can give voice to those omitted from the dominant narratives, the voices of Indigenous women, of immigrant women, women who challenged the status quo, and women who had such great strength. And by including historical narratives that honor these diverse women, I'm also suggesting that teachers are honoring the diversity of their own students and communities. And you can seek out these stories now. You can seek them out through the Black History Society, through oral histories that are available in your community, through, as I've noted, published scholarship, through local community groups. And one last place that I want to acknowledge where you can access is in Plaques. So Toronto has this wonderful plaque, and Ontario has a plaque program. Heritage Toronto has a particular plaque program that does recognize women. So here we're seeing the plaque for Mary Ann Shad Carey. And so you can go take the kids to the plaque and learn from that as another way to find local history. Okay, so my first, I'll go back to the strategies. I want to keep going so that I make sure I get all this in. So my current research is examining the ways in which our textbooks and materials we use in the class look at war. That's what I'm looking at a lot, the way we teach war and where women are included in war. So as you know, at one time women were sidebars in the textbook, and they had a few sentences about their charitable work. And now they've grown to full pages, but you know, if you wouldn't see photos like this. So even the sort of dominant story about what women have, they still appear within these same kind of constructs. And we don't really look at them more closely. Most history texts recognize women's munitions factory work. They all throw in something there and a little picture on the side. But they provide only a limited discussion about the working conditions or what their daily life was. And we're talking about over 40,000 women in the First World War. Home front chapters contain references to supply and food production, and they present women there as sort of cogs in this great war machine. In one book, they were calling them citizen soldiers, and they always talk about them in these sort of brief filling the gaps due to the absence of men, but then they'll be back in the home where they belong. Texts always frame the experiences of women within these supportive roles, the duties of good citizenship, good mothers. And they do recognize farm women, but they don't, and actually not all texts do, but they talk about it again, replacing farm workers who are fighting overseas. But they don't allow for the lived experiences of individual women. So I'm thinking of the work of Mara Ketchney and others who have talked about the farmettes, who she says were making less than $4 a week. A lot of them came from urban areas in Ontario, so they had no farming experience. The conditions were extremely difficult. Often they were paying more than what they were getting paid for. It's an opportunity for teachers to explore these narratives, these women scholars who have written about it. Let's bring that in. And then I'm thinking that home front narratives might include the efforts of girls. Girls were very active, the Home Guards, the Girls Cadets, the Junior Red Cross. There were lots of community activities. There was victory gardening, and it would be interesting to bring those in to counter the traditional way that we present women in the First World War. So in this one, I'm saying that this is on the left is the World War I, the Voluntary Aid Detachment. And so look at the bottom, the list of their duties, etc. at the end, because we just can't fit them all in the poster. And their voices, these women in the Voluntary Aid Detachment and the work they did is present in community archives across this country. So I would encourage you to go find it. I included this poster on the right. It's the Second World War, but I just love it because, again, look at the little boxes inside of them talking about what women's work is, sort of this the expectations of women's role, right? So those little icons of filling their roles as mothers, keepers of their homes, but then they are working in the gardens and they're working in the military factors, really embracing the war effort. I do want to point out a film, if you don't know it, that's called And They Knew How to Dance, which is a national film board that is just fabulous, that speaks more to women's particular experiences. They have oral histories that women talk about their experiences. And missing from the history textbooks are always counter-narratives that provide alternative perspectives to women's positions during the war. So there was lots of labor unrest, peace activists, indigenous people, farmers, women's organizations who argued against the war. Agnes MacPhail pressed the government for peace. You can look at the work of Lorna McLean, who's written about Julia Grace Wales, who served as a delegate at the International Congress of Women Peace in The Hague. In 1915, they took a ship across, with bombs going after their ship the whole time to try to stop the war. Anyways, her resolution was adopted. Of course, as you know, in 1915, the war didn't end. But when the war did end, members of the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom did a survey of history textbooks in Canada to look at the ways in which we were presenting a sort of support for militarism, because they wanted to challenge that and change the way the textbooks were written. And I just want to put two things here. So a little bit about Julia Grace Wales and heroic efforts and wonderful peace initiatives. I wrote about the OWN Women in the Feminist History in Canada collection, but there's other collections there by scholars. It's a great book. And the one on the bottom, Worth Fighting For, is a book that came out last year that's about the history of anti-war activism in Canada. And I have a chapter in there about teachers. But there's lots of things in there about women. So those are two really good collections. And finally, then, in terms of war, textbooks that include more than a single sentence about women make the error of uniting women in a single voice. So, in fact, in Canada, women were labeled as alien enemies and sent to government work camps. And here we can see them. There were 20-plus camps and 56 receiving stations that held almost 10,000 prisoners. Women worked on long hours on the farm and in the factory, and they took care of their families. They also were sent to camps. So you can't speak of women within a single voice. Women would have had a wide range of experiences during the war. And finally, you want to seek out collections by scholars. This one, as Jessica had noted, that I was the guest editor of the journal Ontario History on the theme of women in education in Ontario. And the collection explores the work of diverse women in Ontario. And you can see the list there, so I won't read it out to you, but it is a diverse group of women, and it is focused on Ontario stories. These are local stories. So you might be interested in looking at that. So in conclusion then, and I can go back to the strategies slide if you want, or we can start having some questions. I've got here Pat Staten, who produces Women's History Month, and you should go on her website, and she will give you some free women's history posters, and so will I. I have probably 200 of them in my office, so just write me and let me know. So in conclusion, bold steps are needed, I think, to reframe the categories and dominant narratives that we use in history studies, to explore more deeply the diversity of voices, to seek out opportunities for students to deconstruct things, the stories about women and what it means to be a citizen. And teachers today can access hundreds of websites for primary, secondary documents that incorporate these narratives of women, some of which, as I explained, were in the Her Stories, which provides a forum for those stories. And I've listed some resources here and a few great books for you to look at. So just like the Canadian women in our collective past, educators today must recognize that incorporating the lived experiences of women in schools rests on the work of individuals and communities. Scholars and educators have developed history resources and materials that focus specifically on the experience of women, and they're available if you look for them. And as well, educators can bring women's historical experiences into the classroom by, and this has been really the point of this whole talk, developing partnerships within their communities. So bringing in an elder, go into local archives, historic sites, museums, engage in oral histories by documenting the history of local women, engage in walking tours that incorporate the diverse stories and multiple perspectives of women. And as I've noted before, 50% of the population is women, and so I think we should seek out ways to give voice to their lived experiences through 50% of our Canadian history curriculum. And so I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rose. That was wonderful. We've had or mostly statements coming through. So if you have some questions on the tip of your tongue, please start typing them now, and we'll get to them in the next 5 or 6 minutes. I would be happy to start things off with asking you, Rose, if textbooks today, because I'm not in high school anymore, if textbooks today are presenting diverse perspectives, diverse women's perspectives, and if they're not, how can what would you recommend to teachers to help include that in their classroom?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, they're not. But it's not, it's sort of the textbooks, they can't do that, right? They can't bring in, I've presented a lot of different narratives here. So you can see where textbooks, that's not the purpose of a textbook. So they're giving these broad general examinations about the past through particular time periods and places. So as I said, the whole point of this is that it is the job of teachers then, if they want a more equitable examination of the past, is to look in their local communities through archives and museums and historic houses and oral histories and elders to find these local stories to sort of provide the details that the textbooks can't.
Excellent, thank you, Rose. You're welcome to read the questions yourself if you would prefer, and answer as you see fit.
I don't see any questions written down on mine. Am I supposed to see questions? Are there questions in the chat?
Yeah, there's a question from Dorothy, and she asks, Mariana Valverde, who wrote a book about the purity movement, claims in the preface that her colleagues didn't like her work as it was not a pretty picture. Ellipsis, is there something to be said about being willing to look at the negative aspects of women's history?
Yeah, I'm trying to find these questions. Should I be clicking on attendees? Is that
if you click on the chat box that says everyone in the bottom right hand corner.
Oh, there we are. Okay, great. I'm sorry. Yes. So I now see your questions. I'm very sorry. Yes, Mariana Valverde, Dorothy writes, is a great book. And it wasn't a pretty picture, so something can be said about being willing to look at the negative aspects. Yes, well, excellent, Dorothy, exactly. I think that that's something that teachers want to steer away from. They're trying to make history very nice, and often when we look at these different stories that I've talked about, different women that I've presented here, but I've shown the ways you can look and celebrate their stories. There are negative aspects to women's history for sure. There are lots of challenges that women have faced and restrictions, and we need to bring those stories in, obviously, but also, as you can see how I presented them in a very positive light, because they were leaders and doing remarkable initiatives within their community. So I think you can sort of find a balance. Yes, Evelyn says that we're moving away from textbooks. That's true. And in fact, I heard some rumor that the ministry is going to stop producing them in the next 5 years. So that doesn't worry me. I'm not sure that the textbooks can keep up with the changes in scholarship all the time. And as I said, they're just these general books because they have to be. So they're good as a kind of reference, but I think everybody's community has such a rich history, they can bring in so much more. Sorry, so Dorothy says, now the BBC did a writing the century bit where people from all over the UK sent in diaries. Yeah, that's great. Okay, Dorothy, you take that on. That would be just fabulous. But certainly that could be something that you did in your class, where you started to collect diaries from your particular community and in some way see which people you could do some oral histories with to expand that. And like, what an exciting initiative that would be. I'm like all excited myself right now about that, how exciting that could be with the class. So yes, that's a great idea. Evelyn says, I asked about how we access the history of the 1,000 faceless, nameless women who live within the family structure for survival. Yes. Well, as I said, nameless women, certainly that's been a thing that's been a problem, as I said, patriarchal sort of contexts that are in museums and historic houses, and certainly scholars have been trying very hard to find the names of those women, like uncovering that and connecting with communities to find that, but it definitely is it's a challenge. As I said, women are often not featured. Their husbands have been, or their brothers or their fathers, so it didn't. And Evelyn says, my specialty is maritime history, mostly pre-19th century. And yes, definitely diaries tell one story, one-sided story for sure, but everything does. In my own classroom, I tell them, can you please take the word bias out? Because there's nothing that's unbiased. Everything that's been written is written for an audience. It's written for a purpose. And so let's just look at a bunch of biases and not think that we're ever going to find something that doesn't have a bias. So the important thing is to look at a variety of documents and artifacts and oral histories from a variety of people that are diverse and multiple examples to get a broader understanding about the past, for sure. Yes, I always talk about, the classic one of a soldier in the First World War writing from the trenches and saying to his mother, that everything's fine and he's well fed and he's safe. And of course, none of that is true. But at the same time, it's a document from that time period, and so we have to examine it and appreciate it for what it is. But then we better find out what really happened in the trenches so we can compare what he says versus what was really taking place. Yeah, let's see. I see Katie Whitfield is typing. Yeah, you have to know how to read them for sure. That's right. And that would be something that you want to teach with your class. And having some background knowledge helps that. And then exercise for doing that. And can I recommend tc2.ca, Thinking Critically, the number 2.ca. They're just fabulous at coming up with critical thinking lessons for kids to dissect and deconstruct documents so that they find the various perspectives. So Katie's finished writing, and she says, I appreciate your consideration of including a wide variety of women's perspective from all regions and ethnicities. Having the opportunity to open up conversations that incorporate multiple voices so students see themselves, yes, reflected in the curriculum and learning. That's right. And yes, you're right, Katie, that is very important. And that's why I said in my talk that not only are you doing this because it's something that you should be doing to get multiple perspectives, but through that you're honoring the diverse people in your own class, so they have a greater chance to hear their own histories and their own perspectives. So that's very important. So Evelyn adds, I'd rather bring a class of girls to get some hands-on experience making soap, spinning wool, typical female tasks to get a perspective of women's daily life. Well, of some women's daily life, yes, for sure. And it's great. As I said, I did the beads. I did making beads. The interesting thing with going through that was that Naomi Smith has been collecting historic needles and materials from the past. And in fact, the beads were so tiny and the needles were so tiny, they don't even produce them anymore. And she brought some of them out for us to see. And we were like, oh my goodness, we can't imagine that women were that skilled that they could use something that small. And that they could produce something so wonderful like baskets and hats with such tiny needles and tiny beads. And I was struggling with the sort of, bigger needles and bigger beads. So yeah, the hands-on experience, Evelyn, yes, it's very good. Yeah, it's not easy for sure. But I always bring my cup that I made into my class so everybody can see. But I do point out to them that if the elders had not been around the table, it would not look like that. They were very sweet and very supportive and constantly fixing my mistakes. So I have great respect for that. So Dorothy is typing away, and Katie's typing away. So Jessica, you'll be putting up my slides so people can see, can make the web connections, right? Yes, good. That's wonderful. So Katie writes, I agree with you strongly that teaching and learning women's history is the responsibility of all teachers. Any authentic hands-on learning creates for a significant connection to all learners to the content they're learning about. Yes, for sure. And as you probably know, Katie, certainly like a large portion of the people in your class are girls, and their voices are rarely heard in history classes. So it's very important, but also it's important for the boys to hear them, and for them to be there. So thank you, Katie. So Dorothy says, I think it's important to celebrate the incredible skills of our female ancestors. Even just making a meal were also de-skilled. Yes, yeah, for sure. What they had to do was just incredible with so little that they had. And we complain, I guess, about throwing a pizza in the oven. So yeah, it's a different world. But then at the same time, we have our own challenges today that women didn't face in the past. And so it's important for people to compare, continuity and change and cause and consequence, all those disciplinary concepts that are supposed to go into the Ontario curriculum. Making those comparisons are important to our students. Yeah, important for all students. That's right, Katie, you're right. So Evelyn's sharing a story that her 17-year-old son is one of 4 males in a women's history class, and he loves it. Oh, great. So that's really wonderful. And I have 2 sons who in the past definitely heard a lot about women's history. That has influenced them as adults now.
On the note of loving history, I think we'll come to a close tonight. Thank you, Rose, again for your presentation. It was wonderful, and I think based on all the conversation it has generated, it is been appreciated by everybody who's joined us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar on the influence of women's history in the classroom by Rose Fine-Meyer. I am sending a link in the chat now to a survey, just so you can send some feedback to us at Canada's History to let us know about this webinar, how you liked it, any issues that you came across. We're always trying to make them better, and we're always looking for new topics. Have a great night. Anything else to add, Rose? Excellent. Have a great night, everybody.